Echoes of Wisdom has proven to be a fascinating case for me to tackle. While I think that the game is good overall, I couldn't help but to keep circling back to the issues I had when thinking about this game's construction. Whenever I thought of something praiseworthy to say, there would almost always be some sort of caveat that took away from the totality of that victory. As I wrote, I began to realize that I found the specifics of Echoes of Wisdom's failings to be surprising and intriguing. In many ways, what this game does most wrong are things that Nintendo usually gets very right, which was interesting enough to warrant an analysis focused on that criticism. To start, I want to talk about the puzzle design, considering that's what a large portion of the gameplay is. At their best, Echoes of Wisdom's puzzles give the player the feeling that there is a plethora of different possible solutions, where ingenuity is the most important factor for both solving the puzzle and doing it in a way that expresses your playstyle and skill. Unfortunately, that ideal is not reached as often as it should be. Some of this has to do with most puzzles lacking noise. Put another way, puzzles often have no superfluous details that can lead the player off the scent of the true answer. And as such, it's often possible to guess the solution immediately when first sighting said puzzle. As you can probably imagine, this often leads to lackluster and underwhelming puzzle-solving experiences, with many players feeling that the puzzles are solving themselves more or less. For a correct answer to feel satisfying, the player has to be led to believe, even momentarily, that there are plenty of potential incorrect answers as well, which isn't something that can be said about many of this game's situations. Another thing dampening the effectiveness of puzzles are the increases in power the player gains by leveling up the companion, Tri. Gaining access to more Tri power opens up more possibilities for execution of strategies, but it also has a tendency to reduce the challenge of the game as a whole. Every time I got access to a new piece of Tri-Power, I could feel the game become significantly easier immediately afterward. Ideally, rewards for completing challenges should provide more challenges, not allow the player to think less when solving existing ones. Some of the upgrades to Tri's power accomplish this, such as the one that allows the player to summon echoes at a distance. It introduces a decision point when creating an echo, facilitates several defensive strategies a player could choose to engage in while in combat, and is integrated into some number of puzzles, all marks of a well-considered mechanic. Unfortunately, the majority of the time Tri's power is increased, it either gives you more resources or reduces the resource cost of a selection of echoes, which is misguided as it makes it harder for the game to meaningfully hinder the player. At a 3 Tri power limit, many obstacles take some amount of tact and planning to conquer, and using multiple kinds of echoes is often incentivized or required. Increase that number to 5, and suddenly most environments can be traversed by spam stacking old bed echoes. I know which one I think is more engaging. On a less puzzle-focused note, these power increases tend to make it harder for the game's enemies to threaten the player. Past a certain point, enemy creatures can struggle to pressure Zelda's health, as she can easily create an endless army of goons to tank damage for her. Combine this with the health increases provided at regular story intervals, the fact that fighting basic enemies is a mostly hands-off experience, and the sheer power of being able to pause and instantly heal to full by downing a couple smoothies, and it becomes very tough for the game to throw the player an enemy encounter that threatens their life. Because of this, many players will simply choose to run past basic enemies rather than fight them, as there isn't much engagement to be found there, which I think we can all agree really isn't the best showing of this game's combat systems. Regardless of how meaningfully the game can challenge the player with enemy encounters, at least they frequently allow the player to overcome them with a huge variety of differing approaches. Mixing and matching echoes in fights can be interesting to experiment with, and different players will naturally gravitate to varying strategies, strengthening this game's focus on player expression through context-insensitive abilities. It's only to be expected, of course, that puzzles would follow suit in this regard, but surprisingly, many fail to. Maybe the biggest stumble of Echo of Wisdom's puzzles overall is that a shockingly high percentage of them only accept a tiny handful of variable answers, or even only a single accepted solution. For a game with such a wide variety of open-ended and expressive abilities, Echoes of Wisdom falls back to a lock-and-key puzzle setup an unfortunate amount. This sort of situation is designed to only take one answer. The lock of the puzzle is only passable by the use of the key of a certain ability. This isn't a case of there only being one quote-unquote official solution and plenty of unorthodox ways to solve. The closed construction of many puzzle areas means the majority with one answer really do only have one answer. In that way, the open and context-insensitive nature of the ecosystem is often wasted on puzzles where creative possibilities are suppressed, or worse, impossible. To make matters worse, puzzle areas often contain the exact echo type needed to overcome the obstacle presented. While this sort of design is used effectively in the early game to environmentally teach the player about certain mechanics non-invasively, it continues to pop up well past the point it's necessary or advisable. This removes the challenge of coming up with the solution on your own, as the game is essentially spoiling the necessary tool, poking the player with a stick and saying, "Hey, look at what that item or enemy can do. You should make use of it yourself." In some ways, this makes sense, as the player needs to copy a tool before they can use it. But this issue frequently extends far past the first time a player will have encountered the requisite echo. Seeing an enemy you got the echo of 10 hours ago being used as an extremely obvious signpost is just going to make the player feel like the game doesn't respect their intelligence. To summarize the puzzles, lock and key design approaches have their place, but I don't think a game so focused on open-ended problem solving should resort to presenting situations with a single possible answer as much as it does. Puzzles are often too linear, too shallow, and lack the expressive possibilities this game's core mechanics want to allow. There are plenty of exceptions, particularly in Rift dungeons, but those standouts are unfortunately outnumbered by ones less well considered. It's a shame Echoes of Wisdom falls into these pitfalls with this frequency, considering puzzles are one of the game's largest opportunities to really squeeze a lot of juice out of the echo mechanic, so to speak. The end result isn't terrible or anything like that, but the sky was the limit here, which makes what we got all the more disappointing. The more scripted areas of the game can fall prey to issues as well. Quests have an unfortunate tendency to devolve into a repetitive process of instantly teleporting to a specified location and performing light and low engagement puzzle solving, or worse, a series of one-sided conversations with NPCs. This isn't all that representative of open-ended design at its best, but there's a more pressing concern with how the quests are presented to the player. The quest markers on the map tell the player exactly where they need to go to advance the quest in many instances. Removing any possible sense of adventure a player could have gotten from journeying to find something specific from clues embedded in dialogue. When told an approximate location you can expect to find someone or something you're looking for, there's no need to figure out where that thing could be and going to explore on your own. The map will usually just tell you. There's no guesswork to be had. This tends to be less of an issue with side quests than story progression, but that's probably the opposite problem you would wish to have. Hopefully you can see how removing the guesswork associated with finishing an adventure-focused quest also totally undermines that focus on adventure. It goes against the spirit of the endeavor, and it's strange to see this sort of design sneak in when previous Zelda titles, ones similarly focused on adventure, didn't succumb to this sort of convenience. This anti-adventure design trend has made its way into other areas of the game as well. Venturing into a new section of the map will fully reveal it, showing the player a basic terrain overview that gives them the general elevation and layout of each area they enter. This might not sound like much, but it tends to turn traversing the world into an act of investigation rather than exploration. Again, that might not sound significant, but these two processes are very different, and the player investigating the world rather than adventuring through it flavors the game differently in a way that I don't think is positive. Exploration is taking the unknown and making it known. The player does this in adventure games by traveling to areas they have no knowledge of and learning something. Mechanically and thematically, this helps this sort of game to present a grander sense of adventure, by continually having the player move from the known to the unknown for an extended period of time. The key here is that it requires the unknown. Investigation, by contrast, is taking the known and making it more known. The act of investigating something is not one of discovery, at least not wholesale. Even if previously unknown details are extracted from this process, the broad strokes remain the same. Fundamentally, that's what's going on with Echoes of Wisdom's map. Moving into a new section for the first time and revealing it is a moment of exploration, without a doubt. But after that point, venturing around that area becomes an investigation. The player is given just enough of a clue about what the area contains that it becomes a matter of looking at the map to figure out what locations seem ripe for engagement, as opposed to any unknown section being potentially interesting. That terrain overview really makes that much of a difference. There's something to be said for the power of investigation. It can certainly be used very impactfully in the right circumstances, but hopefully we can all agree that taking an adventure game and using investigation in place of exploration for certain aspects can significantly damage that intent of discovery, that sense of finding something. Don't get me wrong, Echoes of Wisdom manages to present exploration in other areas of traversal. but I don't think that undermining the overall adventuring to the extent the map does is very wise. It was implemented this way for convenience and to help the player, but it ended up being misguided. Menuing is also plagued with several relevant issues. Considering the sheer number of echoes implemented, some amount of praise has to be paid out to the developers, but that achievement doesn't seem to have been accounted for particularly well when designing the echo menus. Every echo the player has access to is laid out in the same linear scroll bar menu, which is extremely inconvenient as a large amount of echoes will end up being entirely useless to many players, clogging the list and making the act of locating a specific, uncommonly used echo a chore. Sorting modes help, but not by much, because it's often faster to start scrolling to your desired echo in whichever sort mode you happen to be in rather than first figuring out which mode to swap to. In addition, the most used tab isn't as helpful as it may seem, because it quickly gets filled with echoes that you used early in the playthrough but don't find useful anymore, as well as very specific echoes that get used a huge amount to do very specific things, both of which mean that it's stuffed with echoes you probably don't care that much about in many situations. The other sort modes are some combination of too arbitrary or too niche, making them of little use on a consistent basis. As a result of all this, the most recent tab tends to be the best for locating whatever it is you need at any given time, which is a pain as it's often necessary to scroll for some time to reach your more specialized echoes that you need to pull out once in a blue moon. A favorites tab would be extremely helpful, where players could set a number of echoes to be on a short list of their preferred tools. This new menu could even be radial, cutting out much of the time of scrolling linearly through a list. Funnily enough, there's empty space on the controller this sort of thing could have easily been tacked to, D-pad down, which might be evidence of poor planning, or half-baked implementation of the echoes menus as a whole. If the developers had the guts to axe the sword fighter form entirely, D-pad up could have served as a second hotkey for more favorite space. I suppose that spoils my opinion on the sword fighter ability, so now's a good time to go into it. In short, I find Zelda's sword fighter form to be the most frustrating isolated mechanic in Echoes of Wisdom, because it represents a misguided and uncharacteristically timid design methodology, both mechanically and thematically. To start, we'll look at the mechanics. Broadly speaking, Echoes of Wisdom wants to present an experience centered around the open, context-insensitive, and expressive nature of echoes. In many ways, the game succeeds in this regard, providing an overall cohesive system. But the sword fighter form doesn't interlink with the other aspects of design in many streamlined ways. To see this, let's think about how the player is expected to interact with the game. The two main areas of communication are puzzles and combat. For puzzles, the ecosystem is all that is required for a majority. While the ability to move objects with the staff is expected in a good amount of puzzles, this separate power is itself worked well into the overall system, as it can be used very broadly in many circumstances, which means it doesn't intrude on the echoes. The player uses all different sorts of echoes in all kinds of ways, with it being built overall such that puzzles and echoes are extremely interrelated. Combat is often weaker in this regard, but it's still clear to me that each scenario was designed with the expectation that the player would be using the ecosystem in various ways to best it. There's often some amount of verticality to arenas, which incentivizes creative use of the ecosystem to gain an advantage. And although it's a bit shallow, differing enemy weaknesses and strengths incentivize the player to plan out their summoning more carefully. Regardless of whether some aspects of echo combat could have been fleshed out better, the systems the player uses to interact with the game are the same between most areas of play. This is a big deal, because it affords Echoes of Wisdom a ton of cohesiveness. Instead of switching between mentalities and mechanics depending on the situation, a player uses the same toolset to overcome most everything they're presented with. This is an example of good streamlining, as it causes the player to become more mechanically immersed in the game, lets them develop a deeper understanding of how their tools work in differing contexts, and allows designers to create a broader range of possible situations. This is all assuming, of course, that the sword fighter form doesn't exist. Just like we did with the echo mechanic, let's see how cohesive the sword fighter form is. Right off the bat, it's useless in many puzzle scenarios, which is a massive hit to the strength of its integration. It's clear that it was designed almost solely as a combat option, bringing back the classic adventurer's weapons the series has had for so long. While it is certainly less demanding than Echoes in that environment, it doesn't mesh well with many aspects of battle that were designed to be used in conjunction with Echoes. As it has a shield, it leaves many enemy types completely unable to threaten the player unless in a large group. Enemy weaknesses are also neglected due to the straightforward nature of dealing damage in this form. Because of these reasons, we can see this form lacks proper integration. If a player wants to use it, they switch mindsets from echo usage to a different approach. It creates disimmersion from the constraints of the ecosystem, and works against the united nature of the other mechanics, even though it uses elements that work well in prior entries. As we can see, the same set of tools aren't necessarily as well implemented in a different context. So, why has this mechanic remained in the game when so many other aspects of the older titles were thrown out? I think the answer is surprisingly simple. It's familiar. It's my belief that Nintendo weren't quite convinced that a game solely designed around this new approach would be well received by all. Established fans might be on the fence about how central the ecosystem is, and so in an attempt to both do something new with the series and cater to those who like the older systems, the traditional mechanics were stapled to the core design. With that in mind, we can understand the Sword Fighter form as a concession. The Sword Fighter form is not only mechanically weak and poorly integrated, it also intrudes on the other elements of design in an unwelcome way. Its integration with might crystals is another example of this. The player is often rewarded with this material for completing tasks and exploring the world, but its usefulness is tied solely to the Sword Fighter form. Spending it to level up the effectiveness of Link's arsenal doesn't feel particularly good to me because I have an aversion to that mechanic to begin with, and on a less personal note, it feeds into the streamlining issues of the form discussed earlier. It would have been better if it was related to the core mechanics instead. Maybe this could have been integrated into the level of echoes. Instead of having separate echoes for each level of an item or enemy, a player could upgrade echoes of their choice to the next stage by using crystals. Players could level the echoes they like the most, reducing the number of echoes in the menus, carving playstyle niches for differently inclined players, and tying the might crystals into Zelda's abilities. This also reduces the need for the player to gain access to so much extra tri-power by the end, as they don't need it to summon their high-level echoes, which would allow the game to present more balanced and consistent puzzle-solving experiences. Now, I certainly understand if all these arguments haven't fully convinced you the Sword Fighter form is misguided. Coherency of design is something that's hard to pin down at the best of times, and remains a bit vague in practice. And despite its almost non-existent integration with puzzles, at least it provides a different mechanical way to approach combat. Plus, it's not an unlimited resource, with the power gauge depleting as it's used, which caps the potential damage it can do to gameplay. However, I believe the ways it undermines the thematics of Echoes of Wisdom to be its most destructive aspect. To understand this, let's take a look at Zelda herself. As the first mainline entry with Zelda as the protagonist, I expected this game to go to great lengths to make sure that the themes of the experience reflected the shift. Ostensibly, that seems to have been the case in many ways. The fundamental mechanics have been rethought to align the gameplay with the essence of Zelda's character, and succeed in many ways to have a player adopt a mindset more fitting for the Triforce of Wisdom. As the Triforce of Courage, Link's gameplay often revolves around confronting problems head-on, and using his tools in a very direct manner. That's certainly courageous, but it isn't particularly reflective of wisdom. Zelda, as a character, tends to be more graceful and academic, and these traits have been deftly worked into the adventure gameplay without compromising the exploratory focus. Her core moveset is thematically aimed at cleverness, not at bravery. She solves problems not with strength, but with precision and subtlety, never breaking anything with her own force. She defeats foes by running in and transforming into Link? By slashing and shooting her enemies dead? Looking at Zelda's abilities in this game, we can see that there's a glaring thematic incongruity. The Sword Fighter form is not only very much unlike Zelda, it's anti-Zelda. It doesn't fit in with how she solves problems at all, and worse, it completely undermines the specifics of what she has to offer as a protagonist. I'm certainly not the only one that finds the idea of a game with Zelda as the protagonist interesting for a plethora of reasons. It's just a bit confusing that the designers themselves seem to not share the same motivation. With her newfound powers, Zelda can create echoes and move objects, which is far more than needed to create a huge variety of scenarios to solve with that toolset, which makes the Sword Fighter form feel like an intrusion on what the character has to bring to the table. I can't help but interpret this as a slap in her face, however unintentional it may be. And besides, Even if these classic mechanics happen to fit in with who Zelda is, I don't think it's a good idea to conflate her gameplay with Link's. This game has an opportunity to show us something new, to present basic series tropes in a new context. And while it does manage that in many ways, there's still the unfortunate baggage the sword fighter form brings. It feels really cheap that the most straightforward way Zelda has to deal with these threats is to just transform into Link, damaging the thematic consistency and disrupting what could have been a good opportunity to have her character shine on her own. Aside from the mechanics or the thematics, Echoes of Wisdom can occasionally fall short in the graphical department as well. And no, I'm not talking about the models or the textures. This is something I usually don't bring up in my reviews, generally because I don't have very strong feelings one way or the other about graphical fidelity. But there is one aspect of this discussion I do care about: frame rate. Games are at their best when running at as high of a maximum frame rate as possible, for a plethora of reasons that would go beyond the scope of this video to get into. Regardless, I hope it's not too controversial to say that games are at their best when they render the game world in as high of a frame rate as possible, which is a shame that Echoes of Wisdom is particularly poor in this regard. In some areas, the game manages to maintain 60 FPS, but it frequently dips below this number when attempting to display even moderately complex scenes. In fact, it's hard to find examples of areas that manage to hit a rock-solid 60 and stay there. Usually, moving into view of even a few extra models drops it below that mark, sometimes well below. Walk 10 steps in any direction, and you're bound to see the game frantically smash between chugging at 30 FPS and a smooth 60 for a couple seconds before crashing again. Some cutscenes can even reach sub-30 territory when the image is particularly out of control, and many gameplay sequences aren't much better, unfortunately. What makes this problem extra confusing is that this should have been easy for a game of this art style. The game is clearly going for a toy-like aesthetic approach, with extremely glossy textures that create a plastic-like appearance and an absurd amount of distance blur on out-of-focus objects, giving the impression of a camera zooming in on something small. It's not as if this sort of thing calls for industry-competitive polygon counts, or extremely sophisticated lighting. Something about the way this game has been visually designed is creating an unexpectedly high rendering cost. Maybe the high amounts of gloss on everything is pushing the lighting engine, or the focal blur has a high cost on rendering all the out-of-focus environments. For whatever reason, the Switch struggles with rendering Echoes of Wisdom, and the experience suffers, if occasionally only minorly, for it. Whatever the cause, poor performance on its own isn't the end of the world. In the grand scheme of things, the span of time where this game is only available on hardware that struggles to properly display it is small. Hopefully, Nintendo's next console will have the necessary power to render this game at a better frame rate. What crosses the line, however, is when undesirable gameplay considerations are made to account for subpar performance. One of the great streamlining efforts of Breath of the Wild was the elimination of a loading screen when entering a house or other similar sub-areas. Preloading the contents of a building's interior helped immensely with keeping the flow of the game intact. Having the player wait through a black screen just so they could peek at the inside of a house is not a design practice that should have stuck around in the series, no matter how long the loading lasted. You don't want to punish players for exploring, and it's disruptive to the experience of play, even if it only takes a few seconds. That's why it's so frustrating that these loading screens return in Echoes of Wisdom, and I can't help but speculate the reason for their unwelcome reintroduction has a lot to do with performance issues. It's possible the game would run even choppier with the extra task of having each sub-area partially loaded in, or maybe the engine simply can't have all this extra data in RAM on some technical basis. That last reason is hard to believe, considering both Tears of the Kingdom and its older brother managed it with more complex environments, as well as doing so without tanking the frame rate. Without much to go on as to the internal workings of the engine, I'm forced to conclude, with imperfect data in mind, that poor optimization of one kind or another is the culprit. If you're more knowledgeable about this sort of thing, I'd love to hear your ideas about what the deal with the performance is in the comments. The problems I've explored so far have all needed a longer explanation of why they hamper the game. They're interwoven into the design in a way that it takes a bit of untangling to really see why they might have been misguided. However, there are plenty of other issues I noticed in my playthroughs that harm the experience in more mundane ways. Ones that aren't exactly profound or in need of a deep dive, but nevertheless have a negative effect. The energy meter on the HUD lacks any sort of sectioning, making it hard to judge how much longer you have in sword fighter form. A tiny issue in and of itself, but a baffling mistake to make considering the meter is split into bars in the smoothie UI, which may say something about a potential lack of communication between different areas of the development team. Putting aside the abusable nature of instant health through the pause menu, the limited healing resource of the smoothie system might have been more interesting had it not been blown open by the health recovery provided by beds, which makes the optimal play when damaged and out of combat to simply heal to full with no risk, consideration, or drawback. Not only is this less than ideal for preserving challenge, but it makes incidental and environmental damage entirely immaterial. The Cloud Echo isn't subject to gravity like the other building-focused echoes are, which completely destroys the challenge from most platforming sections after it's acquired, as long as the player is even slightly careful. The Frog Ring accessory is admittedly convenient for moving across slightly hilly terrain, but combined with tri-power increases removes even more of the challenge a more vertical environment could provide. And last but not least, the vast majority of cutscenes are unskippable. Even shorter ones the player will be seeing many times throughout the course of a playthrough. This is unfortunate during an initial play, but if you ever get the bright idea to replay the game, you're going to be sitting through all these dull sequences again, and probably questioning your choice. Many of these issues are small on their own, but combine them with the other mechanics described earlier, and you get plenty of moments of play that are regrettably mediocre. Considering all I've said so far, the easy conclusion is that Echoes of Wisdom is a poorly designed game. There's plenty of very reasonable ways someone could come to think this, if everything I've outlined prior is to be believed. There are many positive aspects, however, some of which I talked about to serve my other points. Overall, it's got a great art style that complements the gameplay and themes, a well-constructed soundtrack that suitably amplifies the moments it's used in, pacing that keeps doling out echoes at a consistent rate across the game, and a core mechanic that's nicely woven into the structure as a whole. What I find so fascinating about this game is not that it's bad wholesale, but rather that the ways it errs are things this publisher rarely gets wrong. The word I've kept coming back to throughout this critique is misguided, and I think that's the best way to sum up this game's problems. Most of them aren't accidental missteps or oversights, but instead purposeful inclusions that ended up clashing with the core mechanics. Tri-power increases devalue the nature of puzzle solving, but they were implemented the way they are in an attempt to give more opportunities for skill expression. Linear and clean puzzle design removes player choice and tends to make puzzles unsatisfying to solve, but it was clearly going for a smoothing effect on that process. The adventuring conveniences undercut the purpose of the adventure to begin with, but were probably included in a streamlining effort. Swordfighter form is mechanically clashing and thematically incongruent, but consideration for legacy players was the most likely culprit. While not every issue fits this mold like these, a surprising amount do, which is an unusual problem for a publisher like Nintendo to have. I can't speak to others' perceptions, but one reason I feel more confident about future Nintendo-developed titles over others is that there seems to be a large focus paid to internally consistent design methodology. Overall, this tends to produce games that have a certain standard of self-coherency, which is something I consider very highly. I've come to believe that, boiled down, this might be one of Nintendo's greatest strengths, which makes it all the more unsatisfying that Echoes of Wisdom is considerably weaker in this regard. Part of this might be due to the game's joint development. It's essentially impossible to know the full scale of communication between Grezzo and Nintendo due to the latter's strict secrecy, but I'm happy to conclude that at least some of the consistency issues stem from the inconsistency of a two-team structure. Disregarding the cause of the issues, the core of the game's structure has a lot of potential. It's surprisingly refined for how much damage it can take from the surrounding material. Creating specific echoes to solve a breadth of problems in an open environment is the great center of this game. But, unfortunately, that heart wasn't allowed to beat with full strength.